Hello again, Kathy here. Welcome to this video lecture on the High Renaissance. We call the period we're about to study the High Renaissance, not because there was anything low about the 15th century, but largely thanks to our old friend Vasari. What an influential art historian, I suppose because he was the first. Vasari saw an arc of development in the art of the previous millennium, and he saw the culmination of that development in the art of the 25 or 30-year period from about 1490, 1495 or so to 1520. And it was his very personal bias to see it mostly in his very own hometown of Florence. Here we see Florence looking good with that well-known Brunelleschi dome on its cathedral. But we'll be talking today about a couple of other Italian cities as well, because even Vasari admitted that some great art was being made in Rome. These cheesecake photos are frank attempts to make you want to go visit these cities, of course. That's the Dome of St. Peter's. We'll be looking at that more closely in a few minutes. And Venice, which has its own famous dome of San Marco's. Those domes make great focal points for a good travel photo, don't they? But Vasari's bias aside, it is true that something absolutely unique was happening in the Italy of this period. Some of the most celebrated European works of art were created in that short span of 25 or 30 years. Some of the biggest names in Western art history worked then, and the two artists who lived on into the late 16th century, Michelangelo and Titian, became international celebrities in their lifetimes, something a 12th or 13th century artist would scarcely dare to dream of, right? Part of the reason for this explosion of amazing work from a small number of very, very gifted artists was that coming together of the patronage system, along with the development of a sort of mystique of the artist as a uniquely gifted individual. Thank you, Vasari. Remember talking about that in our discussion of the Quattrocento. These two things fed on each other to a great extent. Patrons competed to support the very best artists, and artists gained prestige and opportunities from being supported by wealthy and powerful patrons, Lorenzo de' Medici and the large and powerful family that he sired being of first importance here. It is magical when talent and money come together, and yet even that doesn't really seem to explain the phenomenon of Italy during this period of about 25 or 30 years. Art historians normally consider the High Renaissance as ending with the death of Raphael in 1520. I like to think of it starting more like 1490 so that Lorenzo gets to live in it for a couple of years. He died, as you see here, in 1492, but not before getting Michelangelo off to a good start, and as we'll see, the de' Medici family lived on. As I said, Michelangelo and Titian outlived this brief era, and their work went on to change and develop in ways that differ somewhat from the classic characteristics of the High Renaissance. So rather than confine ourselves to just that period of 25 or 30 years, we're going to look at a small handful of 4 artists and see how each of them developed very distinctive styles while sharing a few important traits that are now regarded as characteristic of High Renaissance artwork. First of all, of course, a reliance on the ideals and forms of antiquity, of classical sculpture in particular, like the Belvedere torso, which I've shown you slides of several times because it was so influential for the artists we're going to talk about today, Michelangelo in particular. And of course, classical architecture as well was very influential. Next, a sense of balance, clarity, and stability in their compositions and designs. We'll look at some more Renaissance examples of that very closely in a minute, including this work by Raphael. Their insistence on spatial depth in painting, and Raphael's painting here of the School of Athens is a fine example of that. And finally, an emotional power, which is part of the naturalism and humanism that they inherited not only from classic sculpture like the Laocoon, but also from the artists of the Quattrocento, artists like Masaccio, who were increasingly interested in showing human feeling and the expressive possibilities of the human figure. We're going to start with Leonardo da Vinci, the oldest of the four artists we're going to look at today. You've all heard the expression Renaissance man, I assume. It means a man who could work at a high level in many different fields, the opposite of a specialist, I suppose. And Leonardo certainly was that. He was a scientist, a sculptor, a musician, an architect. He was an engineer, an inventor. And these pages from the elaborate notebooks, sketchbooks really, that he kept all his life show us this inventing, engineering side of his personality. But most of all, to me, he was a painter. He was a brilliant painter. And he loved to say that painting was the most important of all the arts. We'll look at his paintings in a minute, but first let's look at one more drawing of his, a very well-known image that may symbolize the High Renaissance for a lot of people. This drawing, which is known as the Vitruvian Man, is called that because Leonardo was illustrating the principles of a Roman architect named Vitruvius from the 1st century BCE. Vitruvius left a Latin treatise on architecture, which had inspired many people throughout the previous millennium. Vitruvius' notion was that the human body could be used to derive the perfect geometric forms of the square and the circle, and Leonardo is simply illustrating that to show how it works. This drawing and the notes here were Leonardo's study notes, so to speak, just like the ones I'm sure you're taking on this lecture, right? You may be able to see that his notes above and below the drawing of the Vitruvian Man, like those in the notebook pages we just saw, are written in Leonardo's characteristic backwards handwriting. He always wrote his notes so that they could be read in a mirror. Leonardo did a lot of drawing. He left many designs for inventions, many designs for architecture. His great works for me, though, are his paintings. Unfortunately, not a lot of his paintings have survived, but among those we do have are a couple of paintings that he began and didn't finish. And I'll start with one of those. I think they're pretty fascinating because they give us a little bit of an idea of his working method. This image of the Adoration of the Magi, the three wise men of the Christian nativity story, adoring the Christ child, is on a panel. So that means Leonardo would have had time to create an underpainting and then work over it with colored glazes, similarly to Van Eyck, who worked with glazes over a grisaille underpainting, remember? So we call this a monochrome underpainting. It's not grisaille because it's not just grayscale, but it has some warmth to it. In other words, it's basically a brush drawing, a drawing in brownish paint, showing us that Leonardo started by working out the value structure, the light-dark structure of the composition. Remember the special meaning artists have for the word value from your vocabulary? How light or dark a tone is. Normally, Leonardo would have added color in a later stage. For whatever reason, this painting never had the final color applied to it. But in this underpainting, there's something quite different going on from any of the paintings we've looked at yet, and it's quite characteristic of Leonardo. His forms emerge from dark background shadows, so that some of the forms actually seem light against dark rather than the other way around. The figures emerge not in terms of outlines, but in terms of tone. In other words, he's really focusing on showing us the light that these bodies reflect back to our eyes. Remember that we talked about the term chiaroscuro in the last lecture, and you can really see Leonardo pushing that much farther than Giotto or even Masaccio would have taken it, so that his feeling of light and dark begins to unify the whole painting. It's almost as if he's painting the atmosphere itself that these figures are inhabiting, rather than simply separate figures. This fine haze of atmosphere is something you'll see in the other Leonardo paintings that we'll look at much more powerfully in the ones that are finished, of course. It's called sfumato in Italian, and it is very characteristic of his work, really sets his work apart, say, from Michelangelo or Raphael. But we'll see other characteristics of his work that are much more similar to theirs, those high Renaissance traits I listed earlier, which I hope you'll look for in all these artists. For example, you can see that the main figure, the Blessed Virgin carrying the Christ child, forms the focus of all the other figures' attention. They're all looking at her, and her head forms the top of a sort of triangle that unites the group of larger, lighter figures in the foreground. That clarity of organization, that use of the triangle in particular as a very stable way of composing the main volumes of a composition, those are very typical high Renaissance techniques that you will see again, especially in the work of Raphael. You can also see in the background there his use of very careful linear perspective and the creation of that very, very deep space. Look for that in many of the paintings that you'll be seeing from this next century, but especially during the short period of the High Renaissance. The frame of the painting has really become a window into another world now. Linear perspective gave artists the tools to punch a hole right into their surface and create very, very powerful illusions of depth on the two-dimensional plane. In fact, that was the feature of painting which Leonardo believed set it apart from all the other arts, the fact that painters could use technical skill to render the illusion of three dimensions on a flat surface. Let's look at another work by Leonardo, The Madonna of the Rocks. This again is an oil painting. By this time, oil had made it down into Italy from Northern Europe and was well established as a painting medium on panels, although tempera was still used over fresco for decorating walls. You'll see by the glowing color and the much more detailed technique that it has much in common with some of the Northern European work in oil that we looked at in the last lecture. This painting was clearly done by someone who was taking his time, right? And not worried about working quickly to finish while the intonaco was still fresh, as fresco painters had to do. This painting tells a story about the life of Christ, which we haven't seen before. This is not a Bible story, but a speculation that Christ and John the Baptist might have met as children. This sort of story about the life of Christ became popular because of the growing humanism of the time. Believers were being encouraged to meditate on the human side of Jesus' life. And this inspired many painters to take on subject matter like this that wasn't part of church dogma, stories about Christ that could be seen as perhaps more intimate and personal stories. We don't see linear perspective used in this because Leonardo has imagined a meeting out in the wilderness, John the Baptist being associated with the wilderness because, as an adult, he preached in the wilderness about the coming of Christ. John the Baptist would be the older child here, the one Mary is shepherding in towards the center. He is praying to Christ, and Christ, the younger child, is giving him a blessing. We see here again that same triangular arrangement of the main forms in a very stable composition. We see that same clear organization as the Virgin with her hands draws the two children in, and the angel also helps to knit the figures together with her hand on Christ's back and her finger pointing at John the Baptist. The angel is looking right out of the picture at us, making sure we don't miss the point, clarifying the fact that John the Baptist has recognized his Savior, even though he's only 2 years old. Though there's no linear perspective in this painting, a very deep space is created through the use of atmospheric perspective. I think it's with Leonardo that atmospheric perspective really comes into its own in Western painting. We've been watching it develop slowly over the last 150 years or so, as artists from Giotto onwards began to observe nature directly and notice, just as any of us can, that colors and contrast get dimmer and softer the farther back you go into space. But I think Leonardo was the first to really push that to the lengths that the Chinese landscape painters showed us hundreds of years previously. So we see the Virgin's hair and face and drapery painted with very, very fine detail and crisp edges and contrast. All this detail up here, while the rocks in the background get progressively dimmer until they melt into the sky way back here. That's atmospheric perspective. So, to review these features that are quite characteristic of high Renaissance painting, that deep space, that clearly organized composition, the stable triangular format. The thing that sets this apart as being Leonardo is again the sfumato, the way the figures emerge out of their dark background, so that in some cases their outlines are almost lost. It's very hard to tell, for example, where the Virgin's shoulders stop and the background behind her starts, and the darkest shadows on John the Baptist melt into her clothing just a little bit. The hair of the angel melts into the background just a little bit. That effect of the figures emerging from a sfumato is quite new, and you're going to see that develop very powerfully in Baroque painting in the next 100 years or so. I think this is a real innovation of Leonardo's, an important characteristic of his work. Let's look at a couple more. This is a painting you will have seen before, I'm betting. The ones we're looking at today are all among the world's most famous paintings. The Last Supper is a fresco, so you'll see some of that characteristic difference in color and technique as opposed to the oil we just looked at. But alas, it was not painted in the normal fresco technique that has proven so reliable down the ages. Leonardo, who was an inventor, as we've said, experimented with a paint which he believed would allow him to work on dry plaster and thus have more working time than the classic fresco technique. Unfortunately, he was wrong. The paint did not adhere well and it began to deteriorate even during his lifetime. It's been restored rather remarkably, but we can only assume that it is a pale shadow of what Leonardo intended. Still, its composition alone would be enough to make it a great painting, so let's look at that. The theme of the Last Supper comes from the Bible. It's a story of a literal last meal that Christ had with his disciples just before his arrest and crucifixion. And during the meal, he tells them, "One of you shall betray me." Leonardo has chosen to depict that moment. And so we see the groups of men around him reacting to that extremely challenging and emotional statement, some recoiling with horror, some discussing it among themselves. Leonardo wrote in one of his notebooks that the aim of the painter was to depict the intention of man's soul through the gestures and movements of the body. And we really see him doing that here. And that is a feature of High Renaissance, which I hope you'll notice again, particularly in Michelangelo when we get there. Christ is established as the center of interest so powerfully that I have often used this painting in design classes as an example of techniques for establishing a focal point. He is, of course, exactly central from left to right. His torso and arms are in that stable triangular pose, which establishes him as a sort of a calm center in the midst of these dramatically responding figures. Christ has no halo. And none of these mostly sainted men have halos either, which is worth pointing out as another sign of the humanism of the painter and of the times. It makes them seem less like objects of veneration and more like characters in a story, in a drama, right? But the bright window behind Christ that frames his head almost acts as a halo, and it certainly gives him prominence and highlights him literally as the center of interest in the painting. The other thing that is quite striking is that the vanishing point for all the architecture is right behind Christ's head. This makes all these angles describing parallels that are running back into space, the coffered ceiling, which is what we call a ceiling that has those rectangular indentations in it, the tops of the tapestry, the sides of the table, all these lines that are parallel to each other, or would be if you were in a room in real life, appear to meet at a vanishing point. And the vanishing point being right behind Christ's head, all those lines are pointing to him. The clarity and organization of these high Renaissance compositions makes them seem kind of inevitable or obvious. But when we get to mannerism and the Baroque in the next 100 years or so, think back to these and you'll see a striking difference, I think. We're going to look at one last painting of Leonardo's. This also is a painting that you may know if you know any painting. It's certainly another of the most famous paintings in the world. It's a portrait of a woman named Lisa di Gherardo, according to Vasari, our authority on the times. If that's true, and it's kind of a big if, since, as we've mentioned, Vasari is not a completely reliable reporter. But if it's true, she would have been about 25 years old when this portrait was painted. Interestingly, Leonardo kept this portrait with him for the rest of his life, and he traveled around quite a bit, toting this painting, ending up in France, where he died as the guest of the King of France. Leonardo left the painting to a favorite apprentice, but it eventually entered the royal collection of France, and it never went back to Italy. It ended up in the Louvre in Paris, where you can go and see it today. I hope you will. It's difficult to see. It's set back behind bulletproof glass, and there's always a mob of people in that room, but it's well worth the struggle. The thing that almost everyone says when they see the Mona Lisa is that they're surprised at how small it is. It's less than 2 feet wide, and its monumental quality in even a small reproduction makes most people imagine that it's going to be much larger than that when they see it. Some aspects of this painting are very characteristic of the High Renaissance. The deep space, again, established with atmospheric perspective. So you see this clear detail up here, bright contrast, and then very dim contrast and soft detail in the back. The stable triangle, right, of her pose, very simple composition, but extremely clearly organized. But the way the Mona Lisa emerges from her background and is united with it by this sfumato, this use of the brownish haze of atmosphere, that is all Leonardo's own, quite a characteristic trait of his work. The next artist we're going to look at is Michelangelo. He was born in 1475 in Florence. He'd have been 70 years old when Volterra painted this. So if it was painted from life, I have a feeling he took off some years, darkened his hair a bit. Vasari was a huge fan of Michelangelo, so we know quite a bit about his life. Who wouldn't be a fan? I have to say Michelangelo is an artist whose work I find extremely moving and inspiring. He was definitely a driven genius, probably the finest example of the hard-working artist you could ever imagine. He was another classic Renaissance figure who seems to have been able to do anything. He was a sculptor, an architect, a painter. He was a poet as well. I would say that his sculpture is his most important gift to the world. So we'll start with that, but we will look at his painting too, because he created some of the very most famous paintings of the High Renaissance. Michelangelo believed in the human figure, and you'll have trouble finding any work of his that is about anything else. I think that is one thing that ties him so powerfully to the work of the ancient Greek and Romans. He studied their figurative sculpture. He loved what they did with the human figure, and he made it his goal, I believe, not only to take that on fully, but to develop it further. He's an artist whose work kept growing and changing all his life, and he lived a long life. I hope you will notice that as we make this quick tour of his body of work. He started out his training as a painter and was hugely influenced by the work of Masaccio and Giotto, which he would have seen right there in Florence. But he very quickly came to the attention of Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, and he was invited to study the Greek and Roman sculptures in the garden of Lorenzo de' Medici's home. And this is what really shaped his career as a sculptor, seeing what the classic sculptors had done with the human figure. Michelangelo would have been 17 when Lorenzo died. There were a lot of other things going on in the Florence of that period that had their influence on his life. You may remember that we talked earlier about a fiery reformist preacher named Savannah Rolla, who rose to power in Florence at the end of the 1400s and was actually excommunicated from the church and executed in Florence in 1498. Michelangelo would have been 23 then, and he was there for all of that. He was influenced by Savonarola himself, just as Botticelli was, though fortunately not to the same degree. Botticelli is said to have burnt some of his own paintings. Heartbreaking to think of. In the bonfire of the vanities that Savonarola required of his followers. Savonarola, of course, challenged the corrupt and powerful church and ended up losing his own life for it. He also challenged the power of the wealthy humanist ruling class, the Medici, for example, and that challenge to their power was quite effective, at least in the short run. The Medici were run out of town by the Florentines, and a republic was established for a period of just a few years. The Medici would come back, Savannah Rolla would lose his life, and the Medici's classical ideas, or pagan ideas, as Savannah Rolla would have termed it, continued to influence the artists that they patronized. What I want you to understand is the tension that created in the minds and the consciences of artists like Michelangelo. He was dependent for commissions on wealthy people like Lorenzo de' Medici and his sons, and on the very popes that were being challenged for their increasingly wealthy and secular lifestyles. The popes acted more like princes than they did like saints, for sure. And yet, if you're going to be a sculptor or an architect and do large, impressive work out of Carrara marble, you have to have money behind you. I think this was a contradiction that you see Michelangelo struggling against all his life, the purity of his artistic drive, and the corruption, very often, of the system that made his work possible. When the Medici, who had been his patrons, were exiled from Florence, Michelangelo went to Rome, where he was immediately commissioned by a wealthy cardinal, basically a prince of the church, and created the piece that really made his reputation as a young man, this Pieta. Pieta is a term meaning the depiction, the subject, of the Virgin Mary cradling the dead body of Christ in her arms after the crucifixion. This Pieta is now in St. Peters Basilica in Vatican City in Rome. I recently saw it there. It's really an amazing piece, especially when you consider that he was 24 years old when he carved this. I think if he'd carved nothing but that drapery, it would be extremely impressive. But the naturalism of the mourning Virgin, the dead Christ in her arms, just so beautiful. I'm feeling rather speechless trying to describe it. It's easier to talk about its pyramidal form, that nice stable composition, than to say how absolutely, heart-stoppingly moving it is. Michelangelo said of this piece that he wanted to create the heart's image of this scene. And I can only say, I think, he succeeded. The Virgin is made to appear quite young, and Michelangelo said himself of this sculpture that he gave Christ his biological age, but he depicted Mary as a young woman, too young to have a 33-year-old son, in order to express her eternal virginity. By the time he finished this piece in 1499, fairly stunning to think of him doing this in 2 years' time, things had settled down a bit in Florence. A republican form of government had been established with the Medici kicked out, and Michelangelo, returning to Florence, was commissioned by this new city council to create an emblem for their new republic, a figure of David. It was originally intended to be for the exterior of the cathedral, but when he completed it in 1504, they liked it so much, and it seemed such a great symbol for the city of Florence, that they decided to put it in the Piazza della Signoria, right in front of the seat of government, their city hall, I guess you'd say. This is certainly Michelangelo's most famous sculpture. We looked recently at Donatello's sculpture of David, and this is quite different from that. Let's compare them for a moment. Donatello's sculpture, although he shows David in triumph with the giant Goliath's head down here at his feet, looks graceful and light-footed, almost androgynous compared to Michelangelo's. I think even though Donatello had been influenced by his travels to Rome and his view of Roman and Greek sculpture, remember that his David was the first freestanding nude since classical times, Michelangelo pushed that a lot farther. He had been very profoundly moved by the athletic, emotionally charged renderings of the human figure by Greek and Roman sculptors. Let's look one more time at this Belvedere torso, which Michelangelo would have seen in Rome. He saw its volumes, its heroic scale, its musculature, its dynamic twisting pose. Michelangelo was on his way to that, already taking those classic elements into his own style, and we will see those things emerging more and more powerfully. But you can also see, as you look at his David, something that really speaks of Michelangelo's time and place. It's clarity and calmness. There's no triumph yet. It seems more as if David is preparing himself for the fight, and as if he is collecting himself, gathering his spirit and his resources. He's fingering his slingshot in that large hand. He's certainly got that balance and stability that we've mentioned in the compositions of Da Vinci, and which we'll see in Raphael as well. This piece stood for centuries in the Piazza della Signoria and was moved indoors sometime in the 1800s, a few blocks away, to protect it from the elements. There is a copy now in its original place so that you can still see how it looked in the piazza where it was placed in 1505, and the original is in the museum of the Florence Academy. There is a wonderful collection of Michelangelo's later sculptures there too. I have spent many hours there drawing. It's one of my sacred places. I hope you get to visit it someday. The new Florentine Republic wasn't to last. The Medici would soon be back, and meanwhile Michelangelo needed patrons in order to create his work. He soon found himself back in Rome, working again for the wealthy and at this point fairly corrupt papacy. At first, this was Pope Julius II, who wanted Michelangelo back to create a tomb for himself. Pope Julius, like many powerful princes, emperors, pharaohs, etc. throughout history, wanted to honor himself with an extremely elaborate memorial to contain and ornament his sarcophagus or tomb. Michelangelo was the perfect artist for this, being a skilled architect as well as a sculptor. He designed a freestanding sort of sculpture meets architecture with the sarcophagus, the tomb, near the top, which was to be surrounded by a very elaborate mass of sculptures intended to be installed in St. Peter's Basilica, the largest church in the world and the central church of the Catholic faith, which was just then being rebuilt by Pope Julius. Michelangelo did in fact end up carving one of his most remarkable sculptures for that tomb, his Moses. It's an amazing piece, pushing farther towards that muscular, dynamic version of the human figure that we saw in the Belvedere torso and that we were beginning to see in the David. It didn't end up being installed as planned, however. Pope Julius II was to die long before the tomb was finished, and his heirs and relatives repeatedly cut the scope of the project down until it finally almost washed up completely. The Moses and a few of the other figures that Michelangelo intended for the elaborate tomb were finally assembled as a much smaller monument to Julius II, not in his new basilica, but in the Church of San Pietro in Vincoli, St. Peter in Chains, where you can see the Moses today in Rome. I hope you go there. The main reason Julius' tomb was never finished is that he changed his mind about his priorities and decided to work on a more ambitious, larger scheme for the Basilica of St. Peter's instead. And as part of that, he asked Michelangelo to paint frescoes on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, which adjoins St. Peter's. Michelangelo was first and foremost a sculptor. He was such a gifted painter as well that he'd be famous for that if he had never sculpted at all. But he insisted that he was a sculptor. He raced through this amazing fresco commission for the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in an unbelievable period of 4 years. I think that speaks not only to his incredible energy and self-discipline, but also to the fact that he really just could not wait to get back to his work on the tomb, which was his first love, the monumental sculpture that he could only create with that kind of a commission. Ironically, the paintings that he did for the Sistine Chapel turned out to be probably much better known than the sculptures that he created for the tomb of Julius. They're quite an incredible group of paintings. You can see that the ceiling is a very complex space to start with. There's a shallow barrel vault with these more or less triangular sections called spandrels that interrupt the edges of it. And the central region is also interrupted by Michelangelo's choice to paint 10 illusionistic arches on the wall to give himself 9 spaces in between those. And for these, he designed 9 narrative scenes, 9 stories from the biblical book of Genesis, starting with creation of the world at one end and ending with the story of the drunkenness of Noah near the other end. The creation of Adam, the creation of Eve, and their expulsion from the Garden of Eden are the central images. Of course, the creation of Adam, this extremely iconic image where we see the creating finger of God reaching out to impart life to a very limp-looking Adam, is certainly one of the best-known, most compelling images in painting. In between these narrative paintings, we see large figures of Old Testament biblical prophets and pagan prophets called Sibyls. Let's take a close look at this Sibyl. This is known as the Libyan Sibyl, pagan prophet in whose writings many theologians believed they saw the coming of the Messiah Christ, or that she had foretold it. We see her here turning in this twisted pose, very dynamic, athletic figure, holding this enormous book. We need to remember that since he was working in fresco, he had to create these paintings very quickly. Remember, he had only 7 to 9 hours every day to work on whatever part of the intonaco had just been freshly laid. Any mistakes or second thoughts would require chipping off the previous day's plaster, so the design had to be carefully worked out before he climbed up that scaffolding, right? Michelangelo did careful drawings that prepared him to get all the detail that he wanted, to study the anatomy of the form and then be able to paint it very, very rapidly. Here's a drawing of that pose, his study for the Libyan Sibyl. It's quite clear, I think, when you look at this drawing and many of Michelangelo's drawings for poses of women, that he was actually using male models, even for the figures of women. Many theories have been put forward about why he would do that. It certainly isn't because there were no women for him to draw, right? Remember that beautiful Madonna in his early Pieta? Clearly a portrait of some lovely young female model. But Michelangelo, by now, had a unique vision of what he wanted to express with the human form. I think the Belvedere torso and sculptures like it had convinced him beyond the shadow of a doubt that the kind of athletic, muscled energy of the male form was what his art was about. And to masculinize even his female figures, to give them that muscular energy, was part of his expression. For a much better tour of the Sistine Chapel than I can give you with these slides, please watch the short Khan Academy video I provided a link for this week. They do a great job of helping you feel the size and height of the space and making sense of what you're looking at. Nothing is like the experience of being there, however. When you stand in the chapel, as I did just a few weeks ago, as I'm writing this script now, and you see these forms moving in space, all these stories are told with almost nothing else besides the human figure itself. It's quite a glorious visual hymn to the beauty and might of the human figure. As I mentioned, Michelangelo was a poet. He wrote for a friend a poem about the painting of the Sistine Chapel that really gives an idea of the physical discomfort he endured. He didn't work on his back, contrary to myth. He designed the scaffolding he and his assistants used so that they could stand, but there is no way to work on a ceiling without reaching and looking overhead. If you want to know what it felt like to do that for 4 years, an English translation of his poem is in your readings for this week. It was an astonishing feat for human body, and I just love this little doodle that he did. Makes my neck hurt to look at it. Before we leave the Sistine Chapel, another interesting question for a long time was whether or not the ceiling should be cleaned. It was finally cleaned in the 1980s, and here you see the difference that it made, the before and after of the painting of Daniel, one of the biblical prophets in one of the spandrels. Of course, a tiny part was cleaned to begin with, and the difference was so astonishing that then there was quite a struggle of several years among the experts whether or not to clean the whole chapel ceiling. It was finally decided to do it. I think it was a good decision myself. The centuries of candle smoke used to light the chapel before electricity left a layer of grimy brown soot over everything. When that was removed, the colors just glowed forth, as you see, and really changed what the world thought of Michelangelo as a colorist. However, some people strongly objected to the cleaning, and still do, saying that they believe the artist intentionally added a sort of brown varnish over the paintings to tone the color down, and that he would have considered these bright colors to be just a garish underpainting, not his intention at all. I disagree myself, but it is an interesting question, and it may become important to any of you who decide to go on and care about or care for art. For example, Leonardo's Mona Lisa that we looked at earlier. The Mona Lisa seems to have a similar brown haze over her, and similarly, many art historians believe that that was intentionally put there by Da Vinci. Now, that's an oil painting, and it is much more likely, I think, that in the case of the Mona Lisa, Da Vinci would have put a glaze layer over it to unify it and increase that feeling of sfumato. That would be quite typical of his way of working, I think. But the curators of the Louvre have made it very clear that they will never have this painting cleaned because they feel that the potential to damage that hypothetical brown layer is too great. And that means that we can never see the painting as Da Vinci intended it to be seen, because it is definitely dirty. You can't survive in the world for 500 years without picking up some dirt. So it's an interesting subject anyway. Theories about how and whether paintings and sculptures should be conserved or restored, whether artworks that have been damaged should be repaired, or whether they should be left as they are, as artifacts of the historical event that damaged them. All those questions are robustly debated and revisited among people who care about and care for art. Maybe you will be one of those people someday debating these questions. But back to Michelangelo. After Pope Julius II died in 1513, Michelangelo got back to work finally on his tomb. That's actually when he carved the Moses we just looked at, after he had finished the Sistine Chapel paintings. But before he could get very far, the new Pope, Leo X, ascended to the papal throne, and guess who he was? He was the son of Lorenzo de' Medici. So there you are. Those Medici, they go out the door and they come in the window. They're back in power. Leo X, this new Medici Pope, surprise, sent Michelangelo back to Florence to work on some projects for the Medici family. Among these, fortunately, was another big sculpture architecture combination, a tomb again, but for Giuliano de' Medici, Lorenzo's third son. Obviously, the Medici were also back in charge in Florence by now, though they would be kicked out again very soon. This was Michelangelo's first real architectural piece that actually got built, though again never completed. You can see that the figures of night and day seem a bit in danger of sliding off the sarcophagus. There's the tomb, Giuliano. That's because the intention was to have supporting figures below them on either side. The political fortunes of the de' Medici family waned again before those could be completed. The dynamic, muscled figure, somewhat idealized, I'm sure, of Giuliano, however, is so convincingly athletic that it is often referred to as a metaphor of the active life. And the figures of night and day are rather wonderful too. Night is the woman on the left. Michelangelo borrowed her pose from one of the most famous sculptures of ancient Greece, the Sleeping Ariadne, known via its Roman copy, which he would have seen in Rome, and which can still be seen in the Vatican Museum there. Interesting little piece of evidence for his love of these classical sculptures. His day is interesting for a different reason. It is the first of his non finito works. Non finito is Italian for unfinished, deliberately unfinished. One hand and the side of Day's face, the right side, the side that faces the viewer, are carved very roughly. The effect, especially contrasted with the detailed observation of the muscles of the back that you see here, is expressive, if a little unsettling. It makes me feel as if the gigantic day is just in process of being created. This is a work that I feel gives the Belvedere torso a run for its money. Michelangelo also got to do some remarkable architectural work on the Medici's Laurentian library during this time in Florence. His approach to the vestibule and staircase for this library was so revolutionary that we will talk about it again when we get to late Renaissance and Mannerism next week. For now, I just really want you to see how astonishingly skilled the man was in so many areas. Michelangelo ended up returning to Rome again for good in 1534 and largely worked in architecture there from then on. He redesigned the Campidoglio, the top of Rome's Capitoline Hill, the seat of the Roman government and the center of historical Rome. This was a joint project of the Pope and the civilian authorities of Rome. Michelangelo was challenged to restore two ancient buildings which faced each other at an odd 80-degree angle. He brought symmetry to the design with a third building, a bold new facade for the oldest building, and an oval star in the pavement that harmonized the whole complex. This reconstruction of his design just shows the footprint of the new building, but it does give a good idea of the trapezoidal shape that he constructed to solve this rather odd problem. Michelangelo's facade, stairway, and new building were built, but they were not finished before his death. But his design for the star in the pavement was never executed until the 20th century. Fortunately, Etienne Duprat copied Michelangelo's lost original drawing in this engraving, and in 1940, the oval star was finally executed from this plan. Mere 4 centuries or so late. Michelangelo's strong impulse towards symmetry derived apparently from his love of the human figure. He wrote of architecture, and indeed, architectural elements must be derived from the human body. Whoever does not master the human figure and the most important aspects of human anatomy cannot understand architecture. Building work went slowly in those days before electricity and power tools. Many architects did not live to see their designs completed. St. Peter's Basilica is a case in point. Remember back in 1506, the Pope had Michelangelo stop work on his tomb project and paint the Sistine Chapel? In those days, an architect named Bramante was in charge of the reconstruction of St. Peter's, and 2 others had succeeded Bramante since then. Popes, naturally, had been changing too. In 1546, the current Pope, Paul III, asked Michelangelo to take over the work on St. Peter's. Michelangelo was allowed to redesign it, and he agreed on condition he could have direct access to the Pope, no committees in the way, and that he could be allowed to tear down any of the existing building that he didn't like. And he did, too. This gives you an idea, I hope, of his prestige at this point. He was 71 years old, had nothing to prove to anyone, was the undisputed master artist of the Western world. I don't think anyone regretted giving him the power to do things his way on St. Peter's. To design its fabled dome, he borrowed from Brunelleschi's idea of using a double shell construction and created a dome that formed the basis of much dome design for the next 300 years or so. But again, the dome was not actually built until after his death. Frustrating, I would think, to know how likely it was that you'd never see your work built. To be an architect in that day must have required enormous strength of character. Before we leave Michelangelo, I want to show you some more of his non finito sculptures. His mature work increasingly departs from the high finish of his youthful work, and I have to say that some of these are my absolute favorites. The Atlas, for example, really reminds me of his famous insistence that there was a figure hidden in the block, and that his job was to find it and release it. Look at the face, barely visible, under the weight of the stone that he's almost crushed by. The sculptures that are only partially released and that he left in that condition seem to me to be particularly moving and expressive. You can feel them struggling to emerge from the stone, just as the artist must have struggled to release them. There are a number of these in the Florence Academy Museum. Make sure to spend some time with them once you've seen the David. And in this late deposition, Jesus' body being removed from the cross, You can see that he is now much less concerned about proving his skills and abilities and feels much more freedom to use the figures as expressively as he wants. This deposition is unfinished because though Michelangelo intended it for his own tomb, he smashed it and abandoned it in 1555. Some think because he found the marble was defective, although we can't know for sure. It's far enough along that you can see him playing freely with the sizes of the figures, and the beautiful, somber sadness of it is exquisite to me. The very large figure of Nicodemus, who provided Jesus with a tomb and burial, is Michelangelo's own self-portrait. And some theorize that he actually abandoned the statue because the kind of personal access to God that he shows here was frowned on by the church, perhaps too close to the theories of the Protestant Reformation that was heating up in Northern Europe at the time. Again, we just can't know. But in its non finito state, it's one of the world's great works of sculpture. I'll just mention that the guy was in his 70s when he created this piece. We know of one other self-portrait by Michelangelo. He was commissioned to return to the Sistine Chapel in 1536 to paint the Last Judgment on the end wall, and it is this painting that includes a self-portrait as the Prophet Bartholomew. Zoom into the Prophet Bartholomew here. It is easy to see the influence of the Belvedere torso, right? In this twisting, muscular figure with its foreshortened leg. The Prophet Bartholomew was martyred by being flayed, which sounds horribly unpleasant, and he's portrayed with a knife in one hand and his own skin in the other. Nice metaphor for the life of the tormented sculptor, I guess. A study of Michelangelo's life will definitely give you the feeling that he was tortured, possibly by some of the contradictions that he felt as a deeply religious person, a follower of Savannah Rolla, remember, who had wanted to reform the church. Michelangelo's obvious drive to create, and on his own terms, speaks to me of a great purity of purpose. And his writing shows him to be a person of deep faith. But the requirements of his art made it impossible to create his work without huge amounts of money, and thus the patronage of some wealthy and often corrupt churchmen. He must have felt co-opted, at least at times. At any rate, he puts Bartholomew, his self-portrait, on the side of the souls who are not being resurrected at the Last Judgment. That's a sad note on which to leave Michelangelo, but we must go on. Our last two artists are painters, so you'll be relieved, I'm sure, to hear that their bodies of work are not quite so complex and multifaceted as Leonardo's or particularly Michelangelo's. Raphael of Urbino is really primarily remembered as a painter, and I think many people would say that his are the quintessential paintings of the Renaissance. He was very productive. Fortunately, for he didn't live to be old. Many of his early works are Madonnas. I showed you this one at the very beginning as an example of the balance, clarity, and stability of design that characterizes the High Renaissance, remember? This Madonna del Prato, Madonna of the Meadow, again, is a painting of a hypothetical meeting between baby Jesus and baby John the Baptist, with the Virgin Mary presiding over them. Same subject as the Leonardo that we looked at earlier. So let's compare it. You see the strong, clear organization in both paintings, very characteristic of High Renaissance. You see the very stable triangular form of the groups of figures in both. You see a very deep space in both. Again, no opportunity for linear perspective in either, but we do see some fine atmospheric perspective in both. Of course, what makes this painting so different from Leonardo's is Raphael's feeling of light, that luminous clarity. The air seems to be full of light coming from really every direction. There isn't a strong sense of cast shadows, even though the forms are very gently modeled in light and shadow. The babies and the Virgin are idealized. You get the feeling they're as beautiful as Raphael could manage to paint them. And he was no slouch. I believe he was 24 years old when he painted this. and was clearly making a well-deserved name for himself already. It was just a year later that he was summoned to Rome by Pope Julius II, who you will remember by that time was putting Michelangelo to work, painting the Sistine Chapel. Raphael was commissioned to work in the room next door, which at that time was Julius' library. Within the huge arches of its four walls, and we see two of them here, Raphael created four paintings that really almost seem to sum up the humanism of the High Renaissance. The subjects were the four domains of learning: theology, philosophy, law, and the arts. This photo of the interior showing two of the paintings gives you some idea of their scale. The room is called the Stanza della Segnatura because it was later used for the Pope to formally sign important documents. Probably the most famous of Raphael's frescoes, which you see here on the right, is the School of Athens, representing philosophy. And its classical subject really embodies that spirit of looking back to Greece and Rome, so important a feature of the Renaissance. The central figures, most art historians agree, are meant to be the famous Greek philosophers Plato on the left, Plato here, and his student Aristotle. And there are numerous other Greek philosophers gathered in the groups around them. But what is really striking about this painting is the similarity between the way these figures are handled and the way Michelangelo was painting his own figures on the Sistine Chapel ceiling right next door. Raphael, the younger of the two painters, was clearly influenced by the work of Michelangelo. We're no longer seeing that delicate, pristine, luminous beauty of the Madonna, but something much more robust and athletic, frankly, much more like Michelangelo, right? Raphael even acknowledges that by putting a portrait of Michelangelo in the foreground of the painting right here. This figure sitting, drawing on a block of marble. Art historians believe that the decision to include the portrait of Michelangelo was kind of a last-minute thing because an extra layer of intonaco has been added under it, apparently just so that the Michelangelo figure could be painted in at the very end. And of all the figures in the composition, the one of Michelangelo is, art historians agree, the one painted most in the style of Michelangelo. It looks most like the figures next door on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Raphael's composition here has that same near symmetry and clarity as Leonardo's Last Supper, and Raphael uses that same device of putting the vanishing point in this one-point perspective system right behind the figures that he wants us to focus on. His architecture, of course, is much more complex, and the space is much deeper than in the Last Supper. Raphael seems to be much more clearly inspired by great ancient Roman architecture. The School of Athens refers to humanism most powerfully through its subject matter, though. Many scholars believe that Plato and Aristotle reflected two different branches or schools of philosophy. Plato was an idealist, holding that only pure ideas can capture the essence of things, and Aristotle, here, an empiricist, believing that knowledge must be pursued through the experience of our senses. After setting up their conversation in the center of the School of Athens, Raphael then apparently positioned other philosophers on either side, either the Plato or the Aristotle side, depending whether he believed they were idealists or empiricists. The interesting thing, of course, is that he used many of his contemporaries as models for the philosophers. So he was placing those real people into these philosophical camps. So, for example, the model for Plato seems to have been Leonardo. The model for Euclid, who was painted on the Aristotle, the empiricist side, seems to have been for Bramante, the first architect of St. Peter's, who would have been very available at that time for Raphael to draw, since he was right there working on the basilica. According to Vasari, the man in the black hat here, right here, let's zoom in, is Raphael's self-portrait. So this fella here. Raphael placed himself in the empiricist camp. I'm pleased to see that since I'm an empiricist myself. He looks so young, and he was. Seeing these well-known artists depicted in this important painting shows how far artists had come in the last couple hundred years from being mere indistinguishable artisans whose work could be bought at any workshop to being celebrities, recognizable members of the upper crust with real status. These paintings established Raphael as the leading painter of Rome, especially after Michelangelo left, which he did as soon as the Sistine Chapel paintings were finished. Raphael did many portrait commissions, and we have at least one fresco of a mythological subject, the Triumph of Galatea, showing a beautiful nymph being pursued in vain, apparently, by a sea god since she triumphs. Compare this to Botticelli's Birth of Venus, where the beautiful goddess rides on a clamshell, and you'll see that Raphael is creating a much deeper space. Although he has no rectangular solids here to show off his linear perspective skills, he's able to arrange his figures not only to create space, but to create a wonderfully robust feeling of athletic motion, which is very reminiscent of Michelangelo. The difference between Raphael and Michelangelo, of course, is that Michelangelo didn't consider himself to be a painter. His most famous paintings on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel celebrate the human figure almost exclusively. They are paintings that wish they were sculptures, if I can say such a thing. Raphael was a painter's painter. He loved to create deep space on the two-dimensional plane. He loved to arrange the human figure in a complex composition, and he did that very well. Tragically, he died suddenly of an illness in 1520, a very young man. But in spite of his brief career, his work had great influence, and because of his success and numerous commissions, he employed many apprentices who were directly influenced by his work and continued to give life to his ideas and techniques into the 16th century. I'd like to look at one more painter, another Italian, but a very different painter from the three that we've looked at so far, Titian, Tiziano Vecellio, called Titian in English, worked in Venice. He was very much a humanist, very much a classicist. This first painting that we're going to look at, in fact, is his attempt to recreate a lost painting of antiquity that is described by an ancient Roman author. Titian's version of this lost painting is called the Andrian Bacchanal, because it's about the Greek island of Andros, which was so favored by Bacchus, the god of wine, that he caused a river to flow with wine for the folks living there. So you're seeing the after effects of a river of wine. Titian, like all of our other painters, also painted religious subjects, but I've got to say he really seems to be having fun with this classical subject. He's basically painting a drunken spree here. The term bacchanal refers to any sort of drunken revelry that the god Bacchus would enjoy, and I'm sure he'd approve this one. We've looked at some great painters today, but I think you'll see that Titian has a way with a figure that is all his own and very wonderful. His figures move in space with the freedom of Michelangelo's figures, but they look much softer, don't they? They don't have that athletic muscularity and masculinity of Michelangelo's figures. In fact, it's pretty clear that Titian is at his best and at his happiest when he's painting female flesh. This young lady in the front is pretty clearly draped there. Undraped would be a better word, I suppose, for the benefit of viewers. Male viewers seem to be mostly in mind. Some of the male partiers are pretty scantily clad as well, but they're not quite so obviously on display, right? In fact, some of the figures are a little hard to distinguish back here. They merge into the background a bit. Their outlines are allowed to be a little indistinct, which gives the whole scene a kind of melting warmth. Look back at Raphael's Galatea now, and his classical story seems a bit chilly and uninviting all of a sudden, right? Titian is into it. He's inviting us to the party, and it kind of looks like fun. As I say, Titian painted many religious subjects as well. I love the St. Margaret, which shows the poor thing escaping from the body of a dragon. I don't know what she was doing there. But his heart was clearly in his mythological subjects, and it's hard to avoid the conclusion that they simply allowed him to paint more female flesh. And no one does it like Titian. You have to see his paintings in person to understand their effect. He worked over a warm underpainting, often a very energetic underpainting with plenty of impasto, full-bodied strokes of paint that stand in relief on the canvas. On top of the dry underpainting, he added layer after layer of transparent oil glazes, really a technique that he developed to perfection. His painted flesh has such depth and luminosity because you're seeing light bounced back at you from the reflective underpainting through layers and layers of thin glaze. You almost feel you can pinch the flesh, feel the pulse of the blood running through its veins. It is pretty striking, however, that Titian gives that kind of attention to the female body mostly. You see it over and over in these amazing Venuses and a number of other scantily clad goddesses and nymphs, which afford him the opportunity to show the unclothed female form. Here's a funny one, at least I think it's kind of funny. It was clearly a moneymaker for Titian as he painted several versions of Venus with various distracted musicians. If that sort of thing gets old for you, and it's possible, then I can direct you to my own favorite Titian paintings, his portraits. Portraiture has really come into its own by the High Renaissance and still remains for us today an important subject for painters, obviously. I think some of Titian's portraits are among the great paintings of the world. Here, he harnesses his skill at painting the human form and human flesh and adds an exquisite sense of composition, which I personally find much more powerful in these simpler paintings. This portrait, titled Man with Glove, makes us feel that there is nothing more humanist than a portrait. Titian's gift is to make his sitter seem to be the center of the universe, a subject of supreme import. This extremely interesting portrait of Archbishop Arquinto shows off Titian's amazing way with translucent fabric. Some historians think the veil of fabric here is meant to symbolize the political difficulties which kept this archbishop from assuming his high position in the church. But whatever the reason for it, it shows again that Titian's way with fabric is second to none. His mastery of the possibilities that oil paint afforded him are so fluent and expressive, as well as exact. His free, energetic underpainting explains a lot of that, I think, because it allows him to get that precise layering of the exact tone of color he wants, after his energy has already been established in the underpainting. Speaking of fabric, speaking of flesh, speaking of that combination of fluency and precision, this is the painting I'd like to leave you with today. This is called Man with a Quilted Sleeve, and I invite you just to look at it. Sure, we can talk about how it compares to the other great works of the Renaissance and Proto-Renaissance that we've seen. It owes a great debt to many of them, and it makes its own advances. For example, Rembrandt saw this painting and borrowed its composition for 2 of his self-portraits. What a compliment to Titian. But I think much more important even than its place in art history is the way it speaks to me. There's a communication here for me. I feel both the subject and the painter reaching out to me from this rectangle, from that long ago time, in a way that is very powerful. That's enough talking. Thank you for accompanying me on this tour of 4 amazing artists of the High Renaissance. Join me next week for the Late Renaissance and what follows. And meanwhile, please look at this painting until your heart is contented.